They stand in silence now, giants of brick and decay, their windows shattered like blind eyes staring into a forgotten past. Once filled with the echo of human voices, now only the wind speaks through their halls. These are the abandoned asylums, places built for healing but remembered for horror. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were monuments of hope, promising care for the lost and the broken. But behind their iron gates and locked doors, something went terribly wrong. Patients vanished, experiments went unrecorded, and those who entered often never left. Even today, locals swear the walls still whisper, voices of the tormented, begging to be heard. What happened inside these forgotten institutions? Were they hospitals or prisons for the unwanted? Tonight, we step into the darkness to uncover the truth behind the asylums the world tried to erase. In the early years of the 19th century, society's understanding of the human mind was as fractured as the people it sought to cure. Mental illness was seen not as a medical condition, but as a curse, a sign of sin, weakness, or possession. Families, desperate to hide their shame, sent loved ones away to sprawling institutions that promised rehabilitation, but delivered something far darker. The asylums rose across Europe and America like Gothic cathedrals of despair, towering red brick fortresses surrounded by iron fences and endless fields, designed to isolate those deemed different from the rest of the world. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant and fear. The architecture itself was meant to break the spirit. Long corridors with no end, windowless rooms, and wards filled with the endless murmurs of suffering. Patients were stripped of identity, reduced to numbers on charts. Doctors, armed with primitive knowledge and unchecked authority, experimented freely under the banner of science. Hydrotherapy tanks where patients were submerged for hours, electroshock devices used to cleanse the brain, and early forms of lobotomy became common treatments, not to heal, but to control. These walls, once filled with cries, became soundproof vaults of human agony. At first, the public saw these asylums as symbols of progress. Newspaper articles described them as modern palaces for the insane, where compassionate doctors offered care and moral therapy. But behind the thick oak doors, the reality was different. Overcrowding quickly turned these institutions into nightmares. Designed for a few hundred patients, many soon housed thousands. Food ran scarce. Disease spread. The so-called healers began to fear their patients, and in their fear, they grew cruel. Straitjackets, isolation cells, and ice-cold baths became the tools of discipline. Many patients, children, women suffering from postpartum depression, war veterans with trauma, were subjected to months or years of torment simply because they did not fit society's definition of normal. The walls absorbed their pain, and even decades after the last screams faded, that sorrow lingers like a stain. There were places that became infamous. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, where whispers of torture and ghostly apparitions still echo in the hallways. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky, once overflowing with tuberculosis victims whose bodies were sent down hidden tunnels known as death chutes. And the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, a sprawling Gothic fortress that inspired countless horror films. Each of these places shared a similar fate, built with good intentions, but consumed by neglect, cruelty, and silence. The more people they locked away, the less anyone outside wanted to know what happened inside. When journalists or inspectors dared to question conditions, they were silenced or dismissed. For decades, the truth rotted behind those brick walls, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic denial. As decades passed, whispers turned into urban legends. Locals claimed to see shadows moving through shattered windows, to hear the faint sound of crying from rooms long abandoned. Paranormal investigators recorded strange voices calling their names or objects moving on their own. Whether these stories were real or born from imagination, one thing was certain: the asylums had not forgotten their inhabitants. The energy of pain, fear, and despair seemed to cling to every surface, every creaking floorboard, every rusted bed frame. Even the smell of the old wood and disinfectant felt haunted. Many who entered these ruins for exploration described the same sensation, as if they were being watched. Some left in tears. Others refused ever return. By the late 20th century, governments began to close the old psychiatric hospitals, labeling them outdated. The patients were released into the world, many unprepared to survive outside. The buildings were abandoned, left to crumble. Nature began reclaiming the land, ivy crawling up the walls, rain leaking through broken ceilings. Yet, despite the decay, something remains, a presence, an echo of those who suffered there. Historians now look back at these institutions not as places of healing, but as cautionary monuments, reminders of what happens when society hides its pain instead of understanding it. But for those who have walked their halls at night, with only a flashlight cutting through the darkness, it's not just history that lingers there. It's something alive, unseen, waiting, whispering from the corners. And as we step deeper into these forgotten corridors in the next chapter, we begin to uncover stories that were never meant to be told, the secrets that refuse to die when the doors were locked for the last time. When you step inside one of these places today, time does not move forward. It folds back upon itself. The air feels thick, heavy, almost alive. The light that leaks through shattered windows seems hesitant to touch the floors. What remains are fragments of lives once confined within these walls. A child's doll half buried in dust, a rusted wheelchair frozen mid-hallway, charts still hanging in the nurses' stations, names written in faded ink that no one remembers. But the silence isn't empty. Visitors describe hearing footsteps echoing from distant corridors, doors slamming when no wind blows, and soft voices murmuring just beyond the reach of light. These aren't merely stories told by thrill seekers or ghost hunters. They come from historians, journalists, and even former staff who returned years later, only to find the past waiting for them. Every asylum has its own ghosts, but some carry darker legends, stories that blur the line between the psychological and the supernatural, between the cruelty of men and the whispers of something that still lingers beyond reason. Take Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky. Originally built to treat tuberculosis patients in the early 1900s, it became a place of both hope and despair. Thousands died there when medicine failed to save them. Their bodies sent down a secret underground tunnel, the so-called death chute, to prevent living patients from losing morale. During the day, nurses' laughter filled the hallways. By night, it was replaced by the moans of the dying. Today, explorers say they hear gurneys rolling across the floors and see shadows gliding past doorways. Room 502 has become infamous, a place where two nurses reportedly took their own lives under mysterious circumstances. Paranormal investigators claim the energy there is almost suffocating, as if the building itself remembers every breath, every scream, every secret it was forced to hold. Some say it isn't haunted by the dead, but by the grief that never left. Far to the north, in Massachusetts, stands a legendary Danvers State Hospital, the real-life inspiration behind H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Asylum. Its Gothic towers once pierced the sky like claws, casting long shadows over the town below. Built in the late 1800s as a monument to progressive psychiatric care, it soon became a labyrinth of suffering. Overcrowding and underfunding turned Danvers into a living nightmare. Patients were tied to their beds, subjected to early electroshock therapy, and experimented upon in ways now deemed unspeakable. Local legends tell screams that echoed through the valley at night, screams no one dared to investigate. When it finally closed in 1992, the building was left to rot, yet those who entered after closure described a sense of overwhelming dread, as if the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. Some saw figures in patient gowns moving in the dark. Others heard soft whispers calling their names. Even after much of it was demolished and turned into apartments, residents still report flickering lights, phantom footsteps, and cold spots that no amount of renovation can erase. Then there is Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Pennsylvania. Once hailed as a safe haven for the mentally ill and physically disabled, it became one of the most horrifying examples of institutional abuse in American history. In the 1960s, hidden camera footage revealed children and adults chained to beds, lying in filth, starved and neglected. The nation was shocked, and Pennhurst was shut down, but the darkness remained. Visitors say the energy inside is unbearable. Doors slam on their own, cries echo from empty rooms, and shadowy figures dart across hallways. One former caretaker claimed to see a small girl standing at the end of a corridor, only for her to vanish when approached. Another reported hearing his name whispered repeatedly from the darkness, followed by the faint giggle of a child. Whether these encounters are supernatural or psychological projections born from horror's history, they remind us that the echoes of suffering rarely fade quietly. These stories spread across continents, across centuries. Connected by one haunting truth, the energy of human pain never truly disappears. In every asylum, there are rooms where no one dares to stay after nightfall, corridors where the temperature drops suddenly, and stairwells that seem to lead nowhere. Paranormal investigators describe these places as emotional prisons, charged with residual energy, the psychic imprint of fear, despair, and longing that replays itself endlessly, like a broken record in time. Scientific minds dismiss such tales as tricks of suggestion and decaying architecture. But even skeptics have admitted to feeling something in these ruins, an unshakable sense that they were not alone. Sometimes, equipment malfunctions without explanation. Cameras drain of power, or voices appear on audio recordings that were never heard during filming. These phenomena defy logic, but feel undeniably real to those who experience them. Yet beyond the chills and ghost stories lies a deeper horror, not of spirits, but of human cruelty. The real monsters in these asylums were often not the patients, but those who claimed to cure them. The screams that still echo are reminders of forgotten souls who lived and died unseen, locked away because society did not understand them. And so, the line between the paranormal and the psychological blurs. The haunting becomes a reflection of guilt, collective guilt, buried in concrete and iron. Perhaps what we sense in these abandoned corridors isn't the presence of the dead at all, but the conscience of the living, forever haunted by what we chose to ignore. As the moon rises over the crumbling rooftops of these asylums, one can almost hear it, the low hum of sorrow carried on the night wind, the faint sound of footsteps pacing endlessly in empty halls. These places are museums of pain, their walls heavy with memories that refuse to fade. And though many have been demolished, turned into luxury apartments or tourist attractions, the darkness beneath their foundations remains untouched, because some buildings were never meant to be forgotten. In the next part, we will peel back even deeper layers, the secret experiments, the forbidden treatments, and the missing records that reveal just how far humanity once went in the name of science, and how those shadows still stretch into the present. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the word asylum had already lost its promise of sanctuary. What began as institutions of moral reform had turned into laboratories of desperation, where science blurred into cruelty and ethics dissolved behind locked doors. The pursuit of understanding the human mind became an obsession, not with healing, but with control. Within these walls, doctors conducted experiments that today read like horror fiction, yet every one of them was real, recorded in dusty archives or whispered by survivors too scarred to forget. The early asylums were filled with people no one wanted to see. The poor, the disabled, the traumatized, the rebellious women accused of hysteria. And their invisibility made them perfect subjects. They could be tested, shocked, starved, or lobotomized without consequence. Every scream was dismissed as a symptom, every plea written off as madness. What happened inside was justified as treatment, but it was often little more than torture wrapped in the language of science. One of the darkest figures to emerge from this era was Dr. Walter Freeman, the self-proclaimed pioneer of the ice-pick lobotomy. Traveling across America in the 1940s and 50s, Freeman turned psychiatric wards into his personal stage, performing thousands of frontal lobotomies with a surgical pick driven through the eye socket. He called it a miracle cure, quick, clean, efficient. But behind the curtains of his mobile operating theater lay devastation. Patients were left paralyzed, hollow, stripped of emotion, or worse. Some died on the table. Others wandered the halls like empty shells, their personalities erased in the name of progress. The most horrifying part? Freeman often performed these surgeries before crowds of students, smiling as he worked. He kept photographs of his success stories, people whose eyes no longer held a spark, whose humanity had been carved out with steel. Today, the mention of his name sends a chill through psychiatric history. Yet he was once celebrated as a visionary. But Freeman was not alone. Across the Atlantic, institutions like Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam, had already perfected the art of cruelty centuries earlier. Patients were chained to walls, beaten, starved, and displayed to the public as entertainment. Visitors paid coins to gawk at the lunatics, laughing at their pain as if it were theater. Though Bedlam eventually reformed, its method set a precedent that echoed across time. The mentally ill could be treated as less than human. By the 20th century, asylums around the world continue that legacy under more clinical names. Ice baths, insulin comas, isolation chambers, and electroshock treatments became standard practice. In the name of science, minds were broken and bodies destroyed. The rationale was simple. Suffering could purge insanity. What no one wanted to admit was that it also silenced dissent. Those who questioned authority, those who dreamed differently, those who refused to obey, all could be labeled unstable and confined. Inside these institutions, other experiments pushed even darker boundaries. In Canada, during the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA-funded MKUltra project found its way into psychiatric hospitals. At Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, patients seeking help for depression or anxiety were unknowingly subjected to extreme depatterning experiments, endless electroshock sessions, drug-induced comas lasting weeks, and high doses of LSD administered without consent. Dr. Ewan Cameron, the man behind these trials, believed he could erase and rebuild personalities from scratch. Instead, he destroyed countless lives. Victims awoke with no memory of who they were, unable to recognize their families, their identities wiped clean like chalk from a board. Years later, when documents surfaced linking these experiments to U.S. intelligence, the world was horrified. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The asylums that hosted these projects were quietly shut down, their records sealed. Their victims left to live as ghosts among the living, reminders of how fragile the boundary between healing and horror truly is. Not all experiments were born from malice. Some doctors truly believed they were helping. In the 1930s, the idea of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was introduced as a breakthrough. Administered correctly, it could stabilize severe depression. But inside overcrowded asylums, where staff were undertrained and oversight non-existent, it became a weapon. Patients were shocked repeatedly without anesthesia, left bruised and burned, their memories erased by the surges of electricity. Others were subjected to hydrotherapy, locked in tubs of freezing water for hours to calm their nerves. Women who complained of mistreatment were labeled hysterical. Children who cried too much were deemed unfit. The cruelty was institutionalized, masked by white coats and clinical language. Each generation invented a new justification, until the walls themselves began to rebel, until the ghosts of the forgotten demanded to be heard. In some asylums, strange patterns emerged in the final years before their closure. Staff reported bizarre phenomena, objects moving, lights flickering, voices echoing from sealed wings. One nurse at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum swore she saw a patient from the 1950s walk in halls decades after his death, his hospital gown still stained, his face blank and expressionless. A former maintenance worker claimed he found entire rooms that didn't appear on the building's blueprints, makeshift laboratories filled with rusted surgical tools and notes scrawled in fading ink. When investigators arrived, those rooms were gone, sealed behind walls of plaster, as if erased from existence. It was as if the asylum itself was trying to hide its own sins. The boundary between the physical and the psychological blurred completely, leaving behind a residue of energy, not merely haunting, but remembering. When these institutions finally shut down in the late 20th century, their files were boxed up and forgotten, their patients released or transferred without explanation. Families were told nothing. Some tried to rebuild their lives. Others vanished into the margins of society, too broken to return. And the doctors, many of them, went on to teach, to publish papers, to fade quietly into history. Their legacy, however, remained buried in the basements of these asylums, among the mold and the dust. Even today, urban explorers find ledgers filled with patient names, treatment logs stained with fingerprints, and x-rays marked classified. It's as if the buildings themselves refuse to let go of the truth. The deeper one looks into these places, the clearer the pattern becomes. A history, not a medicine, but a manipulation. The asylums were mirrors reflecting our darkest impulse, to control what we fear, to silence what we don't understand. And perhaps that is why they still feel alive centuries later. Because the pain they housed wasn't just physical, it was moral. The evil done within them was not supernatural, yet it summoned something that lingers beyond logic. Maybe what haunts these ruins isn't just a memory of suffering, but the unending question of how far humanity is willing to go when no one is watching. As we prepare to step into the final chapter, the question grows colder, sharper, impossible to ignore. If these asylums have truly been abandoned, then who, or what, still walks their halls at night? The night air around an abandoned asylum feels different, thicker, charged, as if the very atmosphere remembers what happened there. You can smell the decay of time itself. Rust, mildew, old antiseptic. The wind carries a low hum that could almost be mistaken for voices. When you step through the entrance, your flashlight cuts through a darkness so dense it feels alive. Paint peels from the walls like shedding skin, revealing layer after layer of forgotten history. Broken beds, rusted instruments, and fragmented human lives lie scattered as though time stopped mid-scream. Every hallway seems to stretch endlessly, turning corners that lead nowhere, doors that open into shadows. The deeper you walk, the louder the silence becomes.
I hope so.
And then, somewhere in that suffocating stillness, a sound breaks through, a faint cry, a whisper, the shuffle of unseen feet. Rationally, you tell yourself it's the wind or an animal nesting in the ruins. But deep down, something primal inside you knows. These walls have not forgotten. Across the world, investigators, filmmakers, and historians have tried to uncover what remains in these forgotten places. Armed with cameras, thermal sensors, and EVP recorders, they enter the asylums with one question. Do spirits of the past linger here? Some capture whispers, some record cold spots that move like breathing entities. Others leave with nothing but nightmares. In one chilling case, a documentary team filming inside the Waverly Hills Asylum in New York reported hearing footsteps circling them while their equipment malfunctioned simultaneously. Batteries drained, cameras glitched, and microphones caught faint weeping in an otherwise empty room. At Pennhurst, a paranormal investigator claimed to feel a small hand tug at his coat. When he turned, no one was there. Later, reviewing audio, he heard a soft voice say, "Don't leave me." Skeptics dismiss these accounts as tricks of imagination, but the investigators insist the feeling was too real, too personal. They say the energy inside these buildings is not random. It reacts, it remembers, but perhaps the truth of these asylums isn't about ghosts at all. It's about memory, the kind that never fades, even when the body is gone. Every asylum stands as a monument to forgotten lives, to pain hidden beneath bureaucracy and medicine. When we call them haunted, maybe what we really mean is that they are honest. They hold the echoes of everything we've tried to bury. Our fear of madness, our cruelty, our neglect, our shame. These institutions were born from a society terrified of the mind's fragility. We feared those who were different, so we locked them away, calling it mercy. We hurt them and told ourselves it was science. The ghosts that walk these halls are not monsters. They are victims of misunderstanding, crying out for recognition. The supernatural stories, the cold spots, the apparitions, they might be the only way the past can speak when no one listens. And when you feel a sudden chill standing in those corridors, it may not be a ghost touch, but the weight of guilt pressing through the decades. Still, there are those who seek redemption in restoration. Some asylums have been converted into museums, memorials, or art spaces, places where history is acknowledged instead of erased. At the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, guided tours reveal the real stories behind the myths. Visitors hear the names of patients once labeled hopeless, read their letters, and walk through wards where thousands lived unseen. The caretakers there say it's not about chasing ghosts, but honoring lives that were forgotten. Similar efforts have begun across the world to document, to preserve, to tell the truth, because silence allows horror to repeat itself. The asylums remind us that the line between care and cruelty, between science and sin, is dangerously thin. Every time society chooses ignorance over compassion, another building like this could rise again. Yet, not all is redemption. Some sites remain untouched, consumed by nature and neglect. Trees grow through shattered roofs, vines crawl across patient wards, and rainwater floods old operating theaters. The earth seems to reclaim what humanity abandoned, covering scars with green silence. But even as nature heals, the stories persist. Locals still report strange lights in the windows at night, faint piano notes drifting through the air, laughter echoing across empty courtyards. In one chilling account, a group of urban explorers entered the ruins of Waverly Hills Hospital in Connecticut. They found a single light bulb glowing faintly in a room with no power. On the wall, written in faded chalk, were the words, "We are still here." The explorers left in silence, shaken not by what they saw, but by what they felt. The unmistakable sense that something ancient and sorrowful was watching them leave. In the end, the question isn't whether these asylums are haunted. It's why we still feel haunted by them. They mirror the darkest corners of our nature, showing how easily empathy can be replaced by fear, how quickly help can turn into harm when no one questions authority. The ghosts that linger in these ruins are not bound by chains or curses. They live in our collective memory, in every act of cruelty that goes unchallenged, in every life discarded for convenience. To forget them is to risk repeating the same mistakes. To remember them is to face the truth, that the line between sanity and madness, between healer and destroyer, has always been thinner than we like to believe. So the next time you pass one of these structures, crumbling behind barbed wire, hidden in overgrown fields, stop for a moment. Listen. You may not hear screams or whispers, but you will feel something. The weight of stories unfinished, the echo of lives misjudged, the truth that refuses to die. Because history doesn't haunt us to scare us. It haunts us to remind us. The walls of these asylums may be falling, but their voices are not gone. They call out still, asking one question that pierces through the centuries. Will we ever learn to treat the broken with kindness? If you've listened this far, don't let these stories fade again. Learn their names. Read their letters. Visit the memorials that stand where cruelty once ruled. Share the truth, not for fear, but for remembrance. Because every time we speak their stories, the darkness loses a little of its power. And perhaps, in remembering them, we finally begin to heal the parts of ourselves that remain locked behind our own walls.